and losing. And as one of our tweeters said, no drama, no stress on the weekend other than rooting against the Bengals. I mean, even the Steelers didn't play over the weekend. We had some good football, but I was glued to the World Series. And this next guy covers all things baseball for Bleacher Report. Also does a bunch of radio in the Chicago area. You can follow his journey out at Bleacher Report as well as on Twitter at Seth Gruen. He is in Chicago where they're in a fever pitch now, thinking they're back in this thing. And it's been a really good World Series, right, Seth? I mean, I've talked a lot about it. This thing almost deserves 7, and we'll see whether Arrieta's got that in his tank, and we'll see where Tomlin is on Tuesday night as well.
Yeah, I think, look, the first 2 games didn't individually offer much drama, but heading back to Chicago 1-1 added a little bit more of a dramatic element to things, especially when you consider the fact that to start this thing, a lot of people thought the Cubs would sweep. And then the Cubs did their job last night by winning the series and sending it back to Cleveland for Game 6. And I think when you sort of evaluate how great a World Series or any series has been, I think there's a big difference between a series going 5 games and a series going 6 games. So, after the Cubs were able to send it back to Cleveland, I would agree with you that this has been a solid World Series. As is evident by the fact that, by the way, baseball, which I'm proud to say, outthrew Sunday Night Football last Sunday night.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not a shocker, but it was a pretty good football game, too. But everybody had a chance to see something they'd never seen, which is the Indians won a World Series, to do it at Wrigley. They had a lead early in the game. It certainly felt like the Cubs were circling the drain. One guy in this conversation even tweeted that the Cubs were circling the drain, Seth, and it wasn't you. The interesting thing for me is the managing that's going on here. The game behind the game, as they say, and matchups, and the fact that the Cubs haven't hit the ball well, and the fact that the Indians continue now to come back with guys on short rest, expecting them to win the biggest games of their lives amidst, some nasty weather in Chicago. Now, I think the weather's gotten a little better as we get into the week here. They're not going to be playing in 35-degree, raining sideways in Cleveland like they would have had to deal with an hour later in Game 2 the other night. But I still think the short rest for the Indians pitchers, that's not a tried and true recipe for how to win these games. A lot of times, this is right around the time where guys struggle, and I know Andrew Miller is very rested, and he'll probably have 3 or 4 innings in him in Game 6 if somehow the Tribe has a couple-run lead, but that remains to be seen as to whether they can get to Arrieta early and how Tomlin's going to hold up on short rests.
Yeah, well, look, I think that the Indians are in a position right now where they have to pitch guys on short rest. That gives them the best chance at winning. They just don't have the depth in their rotation right now. But I think that Terry Francona's bullpen can be used almost as a starter unto itself. I don't think you're asking a lot of these guys pitching on short rest. And by the way, it should be noted when you pitch on short rest, you're really throwing on a day you'd be throwing a bullpen session anyways. So it's not as if these are guys who ordinarily wouldn't be pitching that day. They'd be pitching a bullpen, certainly different from pitching a game, but that's why you can bring a guy back on only 3 days rest.
Well, I mean, with Bumgarner or Kershaw, you'd throw them out there 120 pitches in this environment. No one's asking these guys to do that either. 85, 90, 95 pitches. Tito doesn't want to see these guys go $110 or $120 right now.
Right. And look, I absolutely think you're right. Andrew Miller's waiting in the wings. Cody Allen. Danny Salazar is a guy who could probably give you 2 or 3 solid innings. It'll be interesting to see how Terry Francona manages Game 6. Obviously, in a Game 7 scenario, all bets are off. And look, if you got a chance to seal things up in Game 6, you go full force and you floor it and pedal to the metal and use Andrew Miller. But the question is, would you want to pitch him 4 innings and potentially burn him out for a Game 7? Now, he very well could be available after pitching 4 innings to still pitch in a Game 7. But, I think you have to see how that game goes, before you kind of speculate on whether or not you're going to throw this guy this number of innings or that guy that number of innings. But, the upshot of all this is they're not asking their starters to do a lot unless your name's Corey Kluber.
He is Seth Gruen at Bleacher Report in Chicago, in the Chicagoland area, covering all things baseball. So, tell me about the Cubs in the World Series in Chicago. You and I have been talking about this since we got together a couple years ago, and I certainly spent lots of time there at the turn of the century back in Northbrook, where I guess a very young Jason Kipnis was knee-high to a grasshopper trying to fight his way out of Northbrook into the Indians lineup to beat his beloved Cubbies as well. I often wondered what it would look like when Cleveland would have a parade. I've seen that now earlier this summer. I've had friends in Cleveland tell me this parade would be even bigger if the Tribe were to pull this thing off later on in the week and have a parade there. But the Cubs scene outside, and I've been there for big events. I've been there for the first time that the Red Sox played there. I was there for Pearl Jam concerts. I've seen the place sort of overrun before, but I can't imagine what it looked like this weekend. I mean, I saw the aerial shots and the overhead shots. It really was quite a scene, right? Quite a memory, I think, for anybody who's a Cubs fan, that even if they lose the damn thing, if they were there on Sunday night, they're probably feeling relatively good about their experience.
Yeah, I wrote about this on Bleacher Report. I think this series has turned out to sort of be very unusual in that playing at Wrigley Field has almost been a disadvantage to the Cubs because Kyle Schwarber's been one of the bright spots on an otherwise struggling offense. And I think the ability to be able to DH him in Cleveland really helps balance the team out a little bit. They were obviously able to win Sunday night. But that said, they weren't overwhelmingly impressive offensively. They got the job done, which at the end of the day, at this time of year, all you want to do is get the job done, win any way possible. We're not making value judgments on how they're winning or whether they're struggling offensively. It doesn't matter. But that said, Kyle Schwarber offers you a left-handed bat that the Cubs sorely need. So, this has been a long time in the making. We haven't had a World Series in Chicago since 1945. Most people in my generation haven't seen one, or everybody in my generation hasn't seen one. Almost everyone in my parents' generation hasn't seen one. So there was a lot of excitement surrounding the games being played here. But from a competitive standpoint, if you want the Cubs to win this thing, it's almost like you're saying good riddance to the World Series. We'll watch it in an AL park where they have a much better chance of scoring some runs.
Well, and certainly Arrieta going to the Hill in Game 6, I don't think he'll be the reason they lose the World Series. I'd be shocked at this point. And I'm a guy that watched him start 100 games for the Orioles, and I always refer to him as Stifler because he really does bear a striking resemblance to Stifler when he's not hiding beneath that beard. With that beard, he looks like a different human being. He arcs his body in a different way. He has a different posture and bullying presence about him in a Cubs uniform. I mean, it's like the guy I sat here and watched struggle for 4 years never existed, but it is one hell of a thing being an Oriole fan and watching him take the ball in Game 6.
Yeah, look, I don't necessarily agree with that totally. To your point, yeah, he struggled with the Orioles, and I think that was partially injuries. That was partially the Orioles have sort of a unique way of handling their pitchers. They're very specific about mechanics. They don't love when a guy throws a cutter, and that's a pitch of Jake Arrieta's, of handling their pitchers. They're very specific about mechanics. They don't love when a guy throws a cutter, and that's a pitch of Jake Arrieta's, and I think throwing that here in Chicago certainly helped him rejuvenate his career to the level it is today. Now, that said, since June, Jake Arrieta has not been a top-of-the-rotation type pitcher. He's been more like a third or fourth starter. When you look at his numbers, and more specifically, his wild inefficiency. I've said this to you all year, that he's a guy who likes to use the full extent of the count to get people out. He's not afraid to go to a full count. He's not afraid to get behind 1-0 or even 2-0. But the problem with that is, you don't pitch deep into games. And I think what we saw in Game 5 when Joe Madden brought Aroldis Chapman in for that, more 2+ inning save, we saw that I think it was an indictment on the Cubs' middle relief, and that Joe Madden just doesn't have a ton of confidence in that group. Because Aroldis Chapman really isn't built for an extended save. He's really a ninth-inning guy. He's not like Kenley Jansen. He's not like Andrew Miller. He's not even like a Zach Britton, which you have in Baltimore. He's a ninth-inning guy, and his stuff's electric, but he's just uncomfortable in those other innings. That said, that gave the Cubs the best chance of winning on Sunday night just because the rest of their middle relief is just so unpredictable. And I think back to the Jake Arrieta comment, if he's not able to get into the sixth inning, which he's struggled to do, I mean, you look at even Game 2, which he pitched in theory well during the time he was in the game, but he wasn't able to stay in the game very long. The Cubs are going to be relying a little bit on their middle relief if that sort of replicates itself in Game 6. And if that happens, the Indians have proven to have the ability to really pile up runs on those guys. C.J. Edwards is not consistent. Justin Grimm, I think, has sneaky good stuff, but he's a guy who's wild a lot and really lacks command of his fastball. And those are a remedy for disaster. Those are a remedy for big innings, or those are suggestive of the possibility of big innings for Cleveland. So I think Jake Arrieta is a critical key to Game 6.
He is Seth Gruen. We're talking all things baseball. He's at Bleacher Report as well as at Seth Gruen on Twitter as well, out in Chicago now that the series turns to Cleveland. Thoughts about Chapman? I know we probably talked about this in the offseason. Look, I'm in Baltimore, right? So we had the whole Ray Rice saga here. We followed the Greg Hardy thing. We were in New York 2 weeks ago when the Josh Brown brouhaha thing happened. Why does Chapman get a free pass? Why is no one talking about domestic violence and abuse, and with him being the guy holding the ball at the key moment for 3.5 innings, right, or 2.5 innings on Sunday night, no one mentions how toxic, how radioactive that guy was last offseason.
Yeah, look, I think that certainly, that's a question in terms of, I don't know if you're pointing to the broadcast, that'd certainly be a question for Fox. I know that locally here in Chicago we had talked about it. We talked about it on the TV show I do regularly here. I know there were columns written in the Chicago Tribune about it, and I believe the Sun-Times as well. I think people did talk about it. Look, at the end of the day, though, I think you need to examine, this whole thing. I don't think if the Cubs didn't sign Aroldis Chapman and were blowing saves in the playoffs and didn't make the World Series or lost in the World Series because of the back end of their bullpen, I don't necessarily know that people would be saying, hey, it's okay because the Cubs didn't go after Aroldis Chapman. That said, the Dodgers said we don't want him. I think some of the things the Yankees have said, the Yankees have been public about the fact that he's been great there. Look, I'm uncomfortable with the situation. I'm personally uncomfortable with it, but I think, part of the futility and obviously the overwhelming desire to win here, just seems to overshadow what he's done, right or wrong. I think at the end of the day, the Cubs, like many teams, talk about character when it's convenient, but when it gets in the way of winning, winning takes precedent. And
he does throw 104. You know that, right? I mean, you're right.
Right. Look, I think if you read the Wright Thompson piece on Theo Epstein, these were factors that he was considering. But at the end of the day, I don't think general managers and executives are keeping their jobs because they have a moral compass. I think that as fans, we need to take some culpability in this because, we're not parsing these issues out from winning. I don't think that, the Dodgers, albeit they had Kenley Jansen, an outstanding closer, but let's say, they lost because of the back end of their bullpen. I don't think that they were sitting, they'd be sitting there saying, you know what, it's okay. We're going to let Andrew Friedman off the hook because, he decided to prioritize morality over winning. At the end of the day, we get sucked in and we as fans too are consumed by winning. But, it's certainly a situation that makes me feel very uncomfortable.
Well, and I think it should make people feel uncomfortable. And I guess my point is he's in there pitching, and it doesn't feel like anybody's uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, look, obviously Fox has not mentioned it to a large degree, and I'm not putting anything on Joe Buck or John Smoltz or any of the Fox production staff. Who I know who I think have taken some unfair criticism during the World Series.
I think they've done a nice job. I mean, I sit and watch the games every night. I think Smoltz doing a really nice job, actually.
Yeah, no, I actually think they've done a nice job too. I think that look, I think that Fox has chosen to sort of focus on the game and not talk about some of those ancillary issues. I think this is a major issue sort of across all professional sports and even in the college sports, and I think that, if the league really wants to take the bull by the horns here, they need to make these players toxic to these teams. They need to put them on some sort of exempt list, as was done with Josh Brown.
Well, it would be really something if on Wednesday night, he's the one getting the last 5 outs, and he's the one that drops to his knees after throwing a 103-mile-an-hour heater to strike out Jason Kipnis before crestfallen 46,000 at Progressive Field, and he's in the middle of the ticker tape. Boy, that just would not be acceptable with Ray Rice in the NFL. I promise you that. It's just it really is an interesting storyline that hasn't been covered so much nationally, I don't think, as much as maybe you've talked about it locally, and certainly some female Cubs fans may have some feelings about that, certainly on the media side, but I don't feel like it's been tight. I feel like it really has been swept under the carpet pretty well.
Look, I can tell you that every time Aroldis Chapman takes the mound, I think about it. It's uncomfortable. Every time I see him, working or when I'm covering a game, it It makes me feel uncomfortable. It's something I think about, and I think it's something that every fan of the Chicago Cubs should think about and consider. And look, I think to some degree we're a society of second chances, and people deserve to rehabilitate themselves and their character. I think it's an egregious mistake. It's an egregious transgression. And again, I don't think anyone's found that silver bullet, that answer to sort of rid sports of this. Because if the Cubs weren't going to trade for Aroldis Chapman, if they weren't going to acquire him, someone is. So, I'm not ready to sit here and totally put this on Theo Epstein, but certainly I think you could collectively put it on his ilk. People, executives within baseball and other sports who just seem to prioritize winning over issues of morality.
He is Seth Gruen. He's got his thing going on out of Twitter as well as a Bleacher Report. You can follow him. It's Gruen as well, and he'll be monitoring all things Game 6 and 7 if necessary into the offseason. We got winter meetings here in Maryland next month. That's going to be exciting, and a whole offseason litany of issues as these teams jockey around. We'll see who wins the World Series later on this week. Hey, I'm pulling for the Tribe. I'm full in on that, Seth, so no offense to you or your family members out there in the Chicagoland area, but it has been a really good World Series. I'm in love with these young players and these young guys, and I think part of this is 10 years from now, how many of these players are going to have rich, full careers and find themselves wealthy guys in other winning situations. I believe that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of young stars in this series. We'll look back years later and talk about that.
Yeah, I agree. Look at the 2011 draft alone. Kyle Hendricks, Francisco Lindor, and Javi Baez are all guys who have had and can have major impacts on this series. So, yeah, a lot of young talent, a lot that both these organizations have to be excited about.
Great having you on. He is Seth Gruen out at Bleacher Report covering the World Series and all things Major League Baseball out at Bleacher Report. You can find me in the Bayou Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We come in the north side and the south side of Chicago, even in Gary, Indiana, and north up around Kenosha and Sheboygan as you cross the border up there by Gurnee. My Midwestern days. Winter is coming. I'll get a trip out there before it's all over with, but not to freeze. Who knows? There might be a parade there before the week is over. Don't forget, the morning newspaper ships to your email inbox at 7 a.m. each and every morning. That is powered up by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. We're at Buffalo Wild Wings and Owings Mills every Monday night for the best seat in the house competition, as well as the blazing wing eating challenge at halftime. Those wings are spicy, and they will make you cry. Our friends at Fully Loaded Transportation provide our limo, and you can win. Get a $100 gift card. Come on out. Have some fun. It's Monday night at Buffalo Wild Wings. It is our best seat in the house promotion. Any breaking news that happens in town will happen first on the WNST Tech Service. It is our best service. Ask around. It's pretty good. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And Dennis Kolatzis will be here on Thursday, driving you home, getting you ready for the weekend and the Ravens and the Stillers. And we'll have plenty on that as we go back and forth to Pittsburgh. Luke is on the practice fields all week long. If there's any breaking news, you'll get it first on the Tech Service. And, of course, Nasty at WNST.net finds me. Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on Facebook Live, as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.